The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching September sun of 1887, its red earth cracked and thirsting for rain that hadn't come in months. Dust devils danced across the barren landscape, swirling sand and sage into tiny tornadoes that disappeared as quickly as they formed. In this harsh wilderness, where survival depended on wit, luck, and an iron will, the small trading post of Esperanza stood like a lone sentinel against the vastness. Thomas McKenna wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he arranged supplies on the wooden shelves of his modest store. At 42 years old, his face bore the deep lines of a man who had spent decades under the unforgiving desert sun. His hands, calloused from years of hard labor, moved methodically as he stocked canned goods, ammunition, and tools that were lifelines for the scattered ranchers, prospectors, and travelers who frequented his establishment. The trading post itself was a sturdy structure built from adobe bricks and timber, designed to withstand both the elements and potential conflicts. Its thick walls provided blessed relief from the heat during the day and retained warmth during the surprisingly cold desert nights. The interior was dimly lit by oil lamps and the filtered sunlight that streamed through two small windows. Shelves lined the walls, filled with everything from flour and coffee to rifles and rope. Behind the counter, Thomas kept his most valuable items locked in a heavy wooden cabinet. Thomas had established Esperanza 7 years earlier, after leaving behind a life of violence and regret. He had been a cavalry scout during the Apache Wars, witnessing horrors that still haunted his dreams. The memory of burning villages and displaced families had driven him to seek a different path, one where he might find some measure of peace and perhaps even redemption. The trading post had become his sanctuary, a place where he could serve both white settlers and Apache people, who occasionally came to trade, treating all customers with the same respect and fairness. The afternoon heat was beginning to wane when Thomas heard the distant sound of approaching horses. He moved to the window and squinted against the glare, making out a small group of riders emerging from the shimmering heat waves. As they drew closer, he recognized the weathered face of Jake Morrison, a grizzled prospector who had been working claims in the nearby mountains for the better part of 3 years. Jake rode a tired-looking mule, its coat dull and dusty from the long journey. Behind him, 2 other men followed on horseback, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the sun. What caught Thomas's attention, however, was the 4th figure in their group. Walking alongside Jake's mule, connected by a length of rope around her wrists, was a young Apache woman. Thomas felt his stomach tighten as the group approached. He had seen enough during his years as a scout to recognize the signs of captivity, and the sight always stirred the guilt that lay buried deep in his chest. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with long black hair that hung in tangled strands around her face. Her traditional Apache clothing was torn and dirty, suggesting she had been traveling for many days under harsh conditions. The riders dismounted in front of the trading post, their spurs jingling against the wooden porch steps. Jake Morrison removed his hat, revealing a balding head covered with liver spots and old scars. His beard was unkempt and stained with tobacco juice, and when he smiled, it revealed several missing teeth. "Thomas McKenna," Jake called out in his gravelly voice. "Good to see you again, old friend. I've got some business to discuss with you today." Thomas nodded politely but kept his eyes on the Apache woman, who stood silently beside the mule. She held her head high, despite her obvious exhaustion, and there was a defiant spark in her dark eyes that suggested an unbroken spirit. Her face, though streaked with dust and fatigue, possessed a natural beauty that spoke of strength and resilience. "Jake," Thomas replied, his voice carefully neutral, "what brings you down from the mountains, and who is your companion?" Jake's grin widened, revealing his rotted teeth. "This here is why I came to see you, Thomas. Found her wandering alone up near Skeleton Creek, half dead from thirst and hunger. Lucky for her, we happened to be passing through." He gestured toward the woman as if she were livestock. "Name's Ayanna, or so she claims. Means eternal blossom in Apache, though she don't look much like a flower right now. Thomas studied the woman's face, noting the way her jaw tightened at Jake's words. She understood English, that much was clear, though she chose to remain silent. Her eyes met his briefly, and he saw intelligence and wariness in their depths. "What exactly are you proposing, Jake?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, Thomas, you know I ain't got much use for an Apache woman up in the mountains, but I heard tell that you sometimes trade with their kind, that you speak a little of their tongue. Figured you might be interested in making a deal." One of the other men, a thin fellow with a scraggly mustache, stepped forward. "Jake's been feeding her for near 2 weeks now, using up our supplies. We need to recoup our losses somehow." Thomas crossed his arms over his chest. "And what kind of deal did you have in mind?" Jake's eyes gleamed with avarice. "I was hoping to trade her for that Winchester rifle you got behind your counter, the one with the fancy engraving. Course, I know it ain't in the best condition, what with that crack in the stock and the firing pin needing work, but it's still worth something." Thomas glanced back at the rifle in question. It was indeed damaged, practically worthless in its current state. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Jake was essentially offering to trade a human being for a broken weapon. The cruel mathematics of frontier life had reduced a person to less value than a damaged tool. "That rifle's barely functional, Jake. Wouldn't be much good to anyone without extensive repairs." "Maybe so," Jake said with a shrug, "but it's still a Winchester. And like I said, we've been feeding this girl for days. Figure it's a fair trade." Thomas looked again at the Apache woman, whose expression remained stoic despite the degrading nature of the conversation taking place around her. He noticed the way she stood despite her obvious exhaustion, the proud set of her shoulders that spoke of an inner strength that captivity had not managed to break. "Give me a moment to consider your offer," Thomas said, disappearing into the back room of his store. In the privacy of his quarters, Thomas leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. The moral weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical burden. He could refuse Jake's offer, but that would likely mean the woman would be taken elsewhere, possibly sold to someone far less scrupulous. He had heard stories of Apache women and children being traded to brothels or forced into brutal labor situations. On the other hand, if he agreed to the trade, he would be participating in human trafficking, something that violated every principle he had tried to live by since leaving his violent past behind. Yet, it might also be the woman's only chance at finding some measure of safety and dignity. Thomas opened his eyes and stared at his reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. The face looking back at him bore the scars of difficult choices and hard-learned lessons. He thought of the Apache families he had encountered during his cavalry days, the children who had looked at him with fear and hatred, and the promises he had made to himself to be better than the man he had once been. Returning to the front of the store, Thomas found Jake and his companions watering their animals at the trough outside. The Apache woman remained where they had left her, though she had found a small patch of shade beside the building. Her eyes followed Thomas as he approached. "Jake," Thomas called out, "I'll make the trade." Jake's face lit up with satisfaction. "Knew you were a reasonable man, Thomas. Always said you had a good head for business." Thomas retrieved the broken Winchester from behind the counter, its damaged stock held together with wire and leather strips. He handed it to Jake, who examined it briefly before nodding his approval. "Pleasure doing business with you," Jake said, extending his hand. Thomas shook it reluctantly, the act feeling like a betrayal of his own values. "The woman will need food and water. She looks half-starved." "That ain't my concern anymore," Jake replied, mounting his mule. "She's your property now. Do what you want with her." As Jake and his companions rode away, leaving clouds of dust in their wake, Thomas found himself alone with the Apache woman. She stood in the afternoon heat, her wrists still bound, watching him with an expression that was both defiant and resigned. Thomas approached her slowly, his hands visible and non-threatening. "I'm going to untie you," he said in halting Apache, his pronunciation clumsy but understandable. The woman's eyes widened slightly at hearing her native language, but she remained silent as Thomas worked to loosen the ropes around her wrists. Her skin was raw where the bonds had chafed, and he noticed she had numerous small cuts and bruises on her arms and hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked in English, suspecting she would understand. She flexed her freed hands, rubbing circulation back into her wrists. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse from thirst but clear. "I need water." Thomas nodded and gestured toward the trading post. "There's water inside. And food." She followed him into the store, moving with the careful grace of someone accustomed to staying alert for danger. Thomas ladled cool water from a ceramic jug into a tin cup, which she accepted gratefully. She drank slowly, savoring each sip, though he could see she was fighting the urge to gulp it down. "What's your real name?" Thomas asked as she finished the water. She studied his face for a long moment before answering. "Ayana." "Jake said it means eternal blossom." "Jake knows little of our language," she replied with a slight edge to her voice. "My name means forever flowering. It speaks of resilience, of life that endures despite hardship." Thomas nodded, appreciating the subtle correction. "My name is Thomas McKenna. This is my trading post." "I know who you are," Ayana said, surprising him. "Your reputation travels among my people. They say you are different from other white men, that you trade fairly and speak truth." "I try to," Thomas replied. "Though I don't always succeed." Ayana set down the empty cup and looked around the store, taking in the various goods and supplies. "What happens to me now? Am I your slave?" The directness of her question caught Thomas off guard. He had been dreading this moment, unsure how to explain his intentions without sounding patronizing or dishonest. "No," he said firmly. "You're not my slave. You're not anyone's property." "Then why did you trade for me?" Thomas struggled to find the right words. "Because I thought it might be your best chance at safety. Jake would have taken you somewhere else, sold you to someone who might not have treated you well." Ayana considered this explanation, her intelligent eyes never leaving his face. "And what do you expect in return for this kindness?" "Nothing," Thomas said. "You're free to leave whenever you choose, but if you want to stay, at least for a while, you're welcome here. There's work to be done, and I could use the help, but it would be paid work, not slavery." For the first time since Jake's arrival, Ayana's expression softened slightly. "You would trust an Apache woman in your store?" "I've trusted Apache people before," Thomas replied. "Some proved more trustworthy than the white men I've known." Ayana walked to the window and looked out at the vast desert landscape. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "Where would I go if I left?" she asked quietly. "My band was scattered months ago. Some were killed, others taken to the reservation. I have been wandering alone since then, looking for any survivors." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy at the pain in her voice. "I'm sorry for your losses." She turned back to face him. "You were a soldier once. I can see it in the way you stand, the way you watch for danger. Did you fight against my people?" Thomas considered lying, but something in her direct gaze demanded honesty. "Yes, I was a cavalry scout during the Apache Wars. I did things I'm not proud of." "Why did you stop?" "Because I realized that the uniform I wore didn't make me one of the good men. It just made me part of the machine that was destroying families and cultures. I wanted to be better than that." Ayana studied him for several moments, as if weighing his words against some internal measure. "My father once told me that a man's past mistakes do not define his future actions, but his willingness to learn from them does." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was. The soldiers killed him at Turkey Creek." The simple statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. Turkey Creek had been one of the engagements he had participated in, a brutal affair where the cavalry had surprised a small Apache camp at dawn. He remembered the chaos and violence, the smoke and screaming, and the sick feeling in his stomach afterward. "I may have been there," Thomas said quietly. "I know," Ayana replied. "I recognize your face from that day. You were the scout who tried to stop the soldiers from shooting the children who were running for the river." Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He remembered that morning vividly, remembered shouting at the soldiers to hold their fire, remembered the commanding officer telling him to mind his own business. He had saved 2 children that day, but others had died, despite his efforts. "You remember," Ayana said, reading his expression. "I remember trying to do the right thing when it was already too late. Sometimes that is enough," she said. "Those children lived because of you. One of them was my younger brother." The revelation hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as he realized that this woman, whom he had just purchased like livestock, was connected to one of the few moments of his military service that he could look back on with anything approaching pride. "What happened to your brother?" he asked. "He made it to the reservation. Last I heard, he was still alive, though reservation life is difficult." Thomas nodded, knowing something of the conditions on the Apache reservations. Overcrowding, insufficient food, disease, and the constant presence of corrupt Indian agents made them little better than prisons. "If you stayed here," Thomas said carefully, "you could earn money, maybe enough to visit him someday or to help him if he needed it." Ayana moved away from the window and began examining the goods on the shelves. She picked up a bolt of blue cotton fabric, running her fingers over its surface. "What kind of work?" "General store duties, helping customers, managing inventory, keeping the books. I travel sometimes to buy supplies or trade with ranchers. Someone needs to mind the store while I'm gone. You would leave me alone with all your goods." "If you prove trustworthy, yes." Ayana set down the fabric and turned to face him again. "How do you know I won't steal everything and disappear in the night?" Thomas smiled for the first time that day. "I suppose I don't know that for certain, but my father always told me that trust given freely often creates trustworthy people." "Your father also sounds wise. He was a better man than I've managed to become, but I keep trying." Ayana walked back to the counter where Thomas stood. "If I stay, I will need proper clothing. What I wear now is torn and inappropriate for working in a store. Of course, we can get you whatever you need. And I will need a place to sleep. There's a small room behind the store. It's not much, but it's private and secure." "What would you pay me?" "The same wages I'd pay any store clerk, $2 a week plus room and board." Ayana's eyebrows rose slightly. "That is generous." "It's fair," Thomas corrected. "Good work deserves fair compensation." She extended her hand toward him, and Thomas took it, noting the calluses on her palms that spoke of a life of hard work. "I will stay for now," she said, "but I am not your property, and I am free to leave at any time." "Understood," and agreed. As they shook hands, Thomas felt a strange sense of hope stirring in his chest. Perhaps this unexpected turn of events might lead to something positive for both of them. Perhaps he had finally found a way to make amends for some of the wrongs of his past. "There's one more thing," Ayana said as they released hands. "What's that?" "You said my name means eternal blossom. That was Jake's interpretation, and it was wrong. But there's another meaning, one that few white people know." "What is it?" Ayana's lips curved in the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "Little Star. My grandmother called me that when I was small. She said I was bright in the darkness, a light that could guide people home." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Little Star. I like that better." "So do I," she said. "Perhaps that is what you could call me here. A fresh start deserves a fresh name." "Little Star it is then." Ubi, as the desert sunset painted the sky in brilliant colors outside the trading post windows, Thomas McKenna found himself facing an uncertain future with a woman who had every reason to hate him, but had chosen instead to offer him a chance at redemption. Neither of them knew what the coming days would bring, but for the first time in years, Thomas felt that he might be walking towards something better than what he was leaving behind. Little Star moved through the store, familiarizing herself with its layout and contents. She picked up various items, examining them with the keen eye of someone who understood the value of goods in this harsh environment. Her movements were graceful despite her fatigue, and Thomas found himself wondering about her life before the soldiers had scattered her band. "Tell me about this place," she said. gesturing toward the surrounding area visible through the windows. How long have you been here?" 7 years, Thomas replied. "I chose this location because it's on the route between the mining camps in the mountains and the settlements to the south. Travelers need supplies, and the Apache bands that still move freely sometimes come to trade. You trade with my people when they're willing to trade with me. I try to be fair, to offer good value for their goods." Little Star picked up a beautifully crafted Apache basket from one of the shelves, turning it over in her hands. "This is well made. Who traded it?" "An older woman named Nalnish. She comes by every few months with baskets and pottery." "Nalnish is my aunt," Little Star said, her voice filled with surprise and emotion. "My father's sister. Is she well?" "She was when I saw her last, about 6 weeks ago. She had a young man with her, said he was her nephew." "That would be Kuruk, my cousin." Little Star cradled the basket against her chest, tears forming in her eyes. "I thought they were all dead or captured." Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest at being able to deliver this unexpected good news. She mentioned that some of her family had been scattered, but that she held hope they were still alive. "When will she come again?" "It's hard to say. She doesn't keep to a regular schedule, but autumn is usually a good time for trading. People are preparing for winter." Little Star carefully returned the basket to its place on the shelf. "If she comes while I'm here, may I speak with her?" "Of course. This is your home now for as long as you choose to stay." The word home seemed to resonate with Little Star. She looked around the store again, but this time with different eyes, as if seeing it as a place of belonging rather than captivity. "I should clean myself up," she said, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "I must look terrible." "There's a wash basin in the back room, and soap. Take whatever time you need." Little Star nodded gratefully and disappeared into the back of the store. Thomas heard the sound of water being poured and realized he should probably start preparing an evening meal. It had been a long time since he had cooked for anyone other than himself. As he gathered ingredients for a simple stew, Thomas reflected on the dramatic turn his life had taken in the span of a single afternoon. This morning, he had been a lonely trader in the middle of nowhere, going through the motions of a life that had lost much of its meaning. Tonight, he would be sharing his table with a woman who represented both his troubled past and the possibility of a better future. The irony wasn't lost on him that Little Star had cost him nothing more than a broken rifle, a weapon that was useless in its current state, much like Thomas himself before today. Perhaps they could repair each other, he thought, both the rifle and the man who wielded it. From the back room came the sounds of washing and the rustle of clothing. Thomas focused on his cooking, giving Little Star privacy while she cleaned up. When she emerged 20 minutes later, he was struck by the transformation. Her face, now clean and framed by damp hair, revealed the full extent of her beauty. Her features were strong and classically Apache, with high cheekbones and expressive dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of wisdom and experience. She had done her best to clean and mend her traditional clothing, and though it was still worn and travel-stained, she carried herself with a dignity that made her appear almost regal. Thomas found himself staring and quickly turned back to the stew pot. "That smells good," Little Star said, moving to stand beside him at the small stove. "It's just rabbit stew with vegetables, nothing fancy. I haven't had a hot meal in weeks. It smells like heaven." Thomas ladled the stew into 2 bowls and gestured toward the small table where he usually took his meals alone. "Please, sit." They ate in comfortable silence for a while, both hungrier than they had initially realized. Little Star ate with careful deliberation, savoring each bite as someone who had known genuine hunger. "This is very good," she said finally. "You cook well for a man living alone. A man learns to take care of himself out here, or he doesn't survive long. Is that why you never married? The solitary life?" Thomas considered the question, surprised by its directness. "I was married once, a long time ago. Her name was Sarah. She died of fever while I was away on a campaign. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. Sometimes it feels like another life entirely." Little Star set down her spoon and studied his face. "Do you have children? No, Sarah and I, we weren't blessed that way. That must have been a great sadness. It was. But life has a way of moving forward whether we're ready or not. Little Star nodded thoughtfully. I was married too. My husband was killed at Turkey Creek, along with my father. Thomas felt his appetite disappear entirely. God, I'm sorry. His name was Bidzil. It means he is strong. He was a good man, a good hunter and provider. Her voice remained steady, but Thomas could see the pain in her eyes. We had been married only 2 seasons. You were very young, old enough to understand loss. She picked up her spoon again and continued eating. But you're right about life moving forward. We can choose to move with it or be left behind in our grief. Thomas marveled at her strength and resilience. Here was a woman who had lost everything. Her family, her husband, her freedom, yet she spoke of moving forward with a calm acceptance that he found both inspiring and humbling. Is that why you agreed to stay here? He asked. To move forward? Partly. But also because I sense you are a man trying to make amends for his past. I respect that effort. Okay, what if I fail? What if I turn out to be just another white man who makes promises he can't keep? Little Star smiled, and for the first time, he saw genuine warmth in her expression. Then I will leave, and you will have learned something about the cost of broken promises. Thomas laughed despite himself. You don't mince words, do you? Life is too short and too hard for pretty lies. And after dinner, Thomas showed Little Star to the small room behind the store that would serve as her quarters. It was Spartan but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small dresser. A single window looked out onto the desert, now bathed in moonlight. It's not much, Thomas said apologetically. It's more privacy than I've had in months, Little Star replied. And it has a door that locks from the inside. That's worth more than luxury to me. Thomas handed her the key to the room. No one enters without your permission. She took the key and tested the lock, nodding with satisfaction. Thank you. There are extra blankets in the dresser if you need them. Desert nights can be cold. I know the desert well, but thank you for the kindness. As Thomas turned to leave, Little Star called after him. Thomas? Yes? What made you decide to trust me today? Really? Thomas paused in the doorway, considering his answer. Maybe because you were the first person in a long time to look at me and see possibility, instead of just another gringo to be fooled or feared. And what possibility do you see in me? Someone who might help me figure out how to be the man I always meant to become. Little Star smiled and closed the door gently. Thomas heard the lock click into place and felt a strange sense of completion, as if a long journey had finally brought him to where he was supposed to be. He returned to the front of the store to clean up from dinner and prepare for the next day. As he worked, he found himself planning changes to accommodate his new employee. He would need to order different supplies, perhaps stock some items that would appeal to Apache traders. He would need to think about how to introduce Little Star to his regular customers, some of whom might not be immediately accepting of an Apache woman working in the store. But these were good problems to have, Thomas realized. They were the problems of a man building something positive instead of just surviving day by day. For the first time in years, he had something to look forward to beyond simply making it through another sunset. Outside, the desert night was alive with sounds, the distant call of a coyote, the rustle of small creatures moving through the sagebrush, the whisper of wind across the sand. It was the soundtrack of a hard but honest land, a place where pretense fell away and only truth remained. Thomas McKenna, former cavalry scout turned unlikely protector of an Apache woman called Little Star, closed his ledger book and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, hope for a future that might be better than his past. In her small room, Little Star lay on the narrow bed and stared up at the ceiling. The events of the day played through her mind like scenes from a strange dream. This morning she had been a captive, traded like an animal for a broken weapon. Tonight, She had a locked door, a paying job, and the first genuine kindness she had experienced from a white person in longer than she could remember. She thought about her Aunt Nalnish, about the possibility of reunion with family she had thought lost forever. She thought about her cousin Kuruk, wondering if he was well, if he still remembered the old songs their grandmother had taught them. Most of all, she thought about Thomas McKenna, the man who had bought her freedom with a useless rifle and asked for nothing in return but the chance to prove himself worthy of trust. She had seen soldiers before, had learned to read the signs of violence and brutality in their faces, but Thomas was different. The guilt he carried was genuine, as was his desire to make amends. Little Star had survived this long by being cautious, by trusting sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. But something about this weathered trader with sad eyes and gentle hands made her want to take a chance on hope. Tomorrow would bring its own tests and challenges. She would need to prove herself capable and trustworthy to show Thomas and his customers that an Apache woman could be an asset to his business. She would need to navigate the complex social dynamics of frontier life, where her presence might be seen as anything from exotic curiosity to dangerous threat. But tonight, for the first time in months, Little Star felt safe. She had a roof over her head, food in her stomach, and the possibility of a future that didn't involve constant flight and fear. It wasn't much, perhaps, but it was enough to build on. As sleep finally claimed her, Little Star dreamed of her grandmother's voice singing the old songs, of her father's hands teaching her to weave baskets, of her husband's laugh echoing across a peaceful camp that no longer existed except in memory. But for once, the dreams were not tinged with sadness and loss. Instead, they felt like blessings, like gifts from the past to help her face whatever the future might bring. In the main room of the trading post, Thomas McKenna settled into his own bed and listened to the familiar sounds of the desert night. But tonight, there was something different in those sounds, something that spoke of possibility and change. The trading post that had been his refuge from the world suddenly felt like the center of something larger and more meaningful. He thought about the broken rifle sitting behind his counter, the weapon that had cost him nothing but had bought him everything. Perhaps he would repair it someday, restore it to usefulness and purpose. Perhaps that would be fitting somehow, making the broken whole again, giving new life to something that had been discarded as worthless. Thomas closed his eyes and let sleep take him, confident for the first time in years that tomorrow would bring something worth waking up for. In purchasing Little Star's freedom, he had unknowingly bought his own. Now all that remained was to discover what they might build together from the pieces of their shattered pasts. The desert wind whispered across the trading post, carrying with it the promise of change and the hope of redemption. Two souls, damaged by violence and loss, had found each other in the vastness of the American frontier. What would grow from this unlikely meeting remained to be seen, but the seeds of possibility had been planted in the red earth of Arizona territory, and in the darkness of the desert night, those seeds were already beginning to sprout.